Welcome back, Anatomy. Today is Friday, May 1st, and hopefully you were able to watch the dissection video and answer the dissection questions during Wednesday's lesson, or if not, you are still working on that. If so, make sure you do that. I believe it's crucial for our understanding of the heart and its parts. It is unfortunate that we are not able to do this dissection in person at this time, but hopefully you are more familiar and more comfortable with the flow of blood and the major landmarks of a human heart after watching that cow heart dissection. Today we are going to dive into the cardiac muscle itself, talking about the muscle tissue, and is talking about the cycle that your heart goes through, known as the cardiac cycle. And so some of this will be review for you, and some of this will probably be new material. So let's get started. First off, cardiac muscle is just one type of muscle. Remember, we have skeletal and we have smooth muscle, and we've talked about both of those already in different units. But the cardiac muscle shares characteristics with both of these. For one, it is striated. Okay, so remember, those are those stripes that you can see. And it's not as easily seen as it is in skeletal muscle. So unfortunately, we really didn't get to look at this under the microscope as we would, so that you can see the differences. But if we were, you could very easily see that there are similarities and differences under the microscope between the smooth skeletal and cardiac muscle. Additionally, cardiac muscle is involuntary, all right, compared to voluntary muscle. We have no control over our heartbeat. If we did, we'd probably be in trouble, because that would be a lot to remember every day that we have to pump our heart. And so naturally, God has designed it to be involuntary, so we don't have to give a second thought to whether or not our heart is pumping blood or contracting or relaxing. Okay, cardiac tissue or cardiac muscle is composed of elongated branching cells, which usually have just one nuclei. And these cells are connected by what's called intercalated discs, which conduct action potentials from one cell to another. Okay, and so remember when we talked about skeletal muscle, we talked a little bit about action potentials down the neuron and how that stimulates movement of our muscles. So a similar concept here, there's going to be action potentials from one cell to another that are ultimately going to stimulate the heart. Which brings me to the topic of the fact that the heart is considered self-stimulatory. That is, it creates its own action potentials. Okay, and so it's able to self-generate action potentials by special bundles of cardiac muscle known as nodes. Okay, and this is basically innervated or controlled by two divisions of part of your nervous system. ANS stands for autonomic nervous system, which is one division of your nervous system, and we are going to study the nervous system next year if you take the second half of this course. But for the purpose of this course this year, just know that the heart is stimulated or innervated by two divisions of that autonomic nervous system and is controlled by these nodes. You have small nodes of the heart, the first being the sinoatrial node, or sometimes referred to as the SA node, and this is located in the upper portion of your right atrium. Additionally, you have the atrioventricular node, also known as the AV node, and that's located near the tricuspid valve in the right atrium. Okay. And so focusing on the sinoatrial node, or SA node, this is often referred to as the pacemaker of the heart. And that's because it initiates action potentials that cause the heart to beat. So it essentially sets the pace, if you will, of the beating heart. It spontaneously generates action potentials that spread to both the atria, so the left and the right atrium, and this signals them to contract. Okay, so in the previous video that I did, we talked about that contraction and relaxation. So this is the SA node is what's controlling that contraction and relaxation. Blood that is in the atria, like we said, is going to get pushed into the ventricles as a result of this. And this tops off the ventricles, which are mostly filled while the atria were at rest. Remember, this is a continuous thing. The atria and the ventricles are continuously contracting and relaxing. And so when one fills, one empties, one fills, one empties, and this beating continues. The AV node, or the atrioventricular node, also has action potentials that stimulate atrial cells. Okay, and so this stimulates the AV node, and this sends action potentials into the atrioventricular bundles. So the atrioventricular node to the atrioventricular bundles. And atrioventricular bundles are just a special set of bundles of nodal tissue that travel through the interventricular septum and branch, traveling to each ventricle. So if you think back to our previous video, that interventricular septum is the division between the two left and right ventricles, right? Okay, so this is in the middle, running down the front side of the heart, or the anterior side, and it branches traveling to each ventricle. It then further branches into fibers that we call Purkinje fibers. I always found that to be a really funny name when I was in college, but Purkinje fibers, which send action potentials to the cells in the ventricles. They are called Purkinje fibers because of the person who discovered them. All right. And so the action potential that is sent by the Purkinje fibers to the ventricles is going to signal for the ventricles to contract after the atria have contracted and topped the ventricles off. And so when those ventricles contract, both the AV valves close, okay, and blood is pushed out of the aorta from the left ventricle, and blood is pushed out of the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle. All right, and so what causes those atrioventricular valves to close? Well, for one, fluid, including blood, flows to the heart, high pressure to low pressure. All right, so there's a consistent pressure, but it's going to flow from high to low. Contraction of the ventricles raises the ventricular pressure. Okay, as they contract, that's increasing the pressure, and blood begins to backflow. It catches in the cusps of the AV valves, causing them to close. And as a result, the ventricles relax after contracting, and the semilunar valves in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk are able to close. And thus, as the semilunar valve closes, it prevents the flow of blood from rushing back into the ventricle. All right, and so how does it do that? How does it prevent blood from rushing back into the ventricle then? Well, when the ventricle relaxes, their pressure drops. So pressure increases when it's contracted, and it decreases, or pressure drops, when it's relaxed. Okay, and that blood that tries to flow from the now high pressure into the pulmonary trunk and aorta is caught in the cusps of the semilunar valves. As a result, the semilunar valves are going to snap shut, preventing the backflow into the ventricle. Once the pressure in that ventricle drops, the atrioventricular valve opens, okay, and pressure in the atria is now higher than in the ventricles. Okay, so the pressure in the atria above is higher than it is in the ventricles below. Therefore, the blood in the atria begins flowing into the ventricle, because remember we said it moves from high to low. This happens before the atria contract, and this is called passive ventricular filling. And it's responsible for roughly 70% of blood transfer from the atria into the ventricles. Again, the atria contract, and they top off the last roughly 30% of the blood. So this entire cycle that we've just described is collectively known as the cardiac cycle, It's a continued cycle of those action potentials on the nodes and the nodal tissue, which then send signals to the different cells of the ventricles and the atria to either contract or relax, and ultimately that controls the pressure, either high or low, which will ultimately dictate where the blood flows. And of course, we have those very important valves spread throughout, the tricuspid, the bicuspid, the semilunar valves. All of those are controlling the backflow as this is happening. Okay, so this entire cardiac cycle is actually split into two phases. The first being the systole phase, and the second being the diastole phase. So the systole phase is the phase in the cardiac cycle in which the ventricles are contracted, while the diastole phase is the phase in the cardiac cycle in which the ventricles are relaxed. All right, and this has to, if these two words look somewhat familiar to you or sound familiar, this has to do with blood pressure. So when you go to the doctors and they put the blood pressure cuff on you and they're checking your blood pressure, they're going to read out those two numbers, a top number and a bottom number. Okay, your top number is your systolic pressure, and it's the pressure in the aorta when the left ventricle contracts. The bottom number is the diastolic pressure, and this is the pressure or the minimum pressure in the aorta at that time. All right, so when you go, ideally they say like 120 over 80, if not a little bit lower as they learn more about blood pressure. But this is what we're measuring every time you get your blood pressure taken at the doctor. And they're checking basically the health of your cardiac cycle and what's going on with your blood flow and the pressure in your heart. Is it too high? Is it too low? Etc. You guys know that the typical sound of a heart is like lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. You know, that's pretty much the typical sound people make when they're intimidating it. And that has to do and can be explained by these two phases. The heartbeat that you hear is actually the closing of the valves. That lub sound is the closing of the valves, and the dub part that you hear is the short snapping sound made by the two semilunar valves when they close. They open silently so you don't hear that, but what you do hear is them closing. And so if you've ever listened to your own heart or someone else's with a stethoscope or just with your ear, the lub and the dub that you hear are the result of these two phases of the cardiac cycle. And with that, that's the end of this video. Make sure that you check out the video resource below that I have added for you guys to better understand some of this cardiac cycle and pressure. And I will see you for your next video next week. Bye.